Before we begin, I want to warn you that this story contains mature themes. It deals with the challenges of new motherhood, family relationships, and infidelity. If these topics make you uncomfortable, you might want to stop watching now. I never thought I'd end up here, questioning everything I believed about love, trust, and family. But it didn't happen all at once. It started small. Quiet. Almost invisible. My dad and I have always been close. After the divorce, it was just the two of us. My mom left, and honestly, I don't even blame her anymore. I mean, how do you stay when something feels broken? But even after she left, I didn't feel like I'd lost everything. I still had him. We made it through the hard parts together, the long nights when the house felt too big, the awkward dinners when neither of us knew what to say. But we found this routine. Every Friday, we'd pick a movie, pile up on the couch, and forget about the rest of the world for a while. It was our thing. At first, it was just about distraction. Movies were safe. We didn't have to talk about the divorce or my mom or how different everything felt. We could just sit there, sharing popcorn, pretending we weren't sad. But after a while, it became more than that. It was comforting. Familiar. It made me feel like nothing had really changed, even though I knew it had. My dad always made sure I felt safe. He'd tuck me under a blanket or let me pick the movie, even if it was something he hated. He never complained. And I guess I started leaning on him more than I should have. I don't think I even realized it at the time, but I needed him. Not just as a parent, but as someone who made me feel like I mattered. I didn't have that anywhere else. My friends at school didn't get it. They'd talk about crushes and parties, and I'd pretend to care, but inside I just felt disconnected. Like I was floating through my life, watching everyone else figure things out while I stayed stuck. But with my dad, it was different. I felt grounded. He was always there. And that meant more than I ever told him. I remember the first time I noticed something felt off. We were watching a movie in his room because the TV in the living room was broken. It wasn't weird at first. I mean, we'd sat next to each other a million times. But that night, the room felt smaller. Or maybe I just felt smaller. I don't know. I caught myself paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. Like how close we were. Or how quiet it got when the movie was over. And I hated myself for thinking it. For even noticing. But once the thought was there, I couldn't make it go away. I told myself I was being stupid. That it was just in my head. And for a while, I believed that. I wanted to believe it. Because the truth? It scared me. After that night, I started questioning everything. Every hug. Every laugh. Every time he looked at me a little too long or asked me if I was okay when I hadn't said anything. I didn't want to think about it. I wanted it to go back to how it was before I noticed. But you can't unsee things. And I started to wonder if he noticed it too. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I needed too much from him. I let myself get too close because I didn't have anyone else. And maybe he just wanted to protect me. Maybe that's all it was. But even now, I'm not sure. And that's the part that hurts the most. Not knowing if I imagined it, or if I didn't. I don't think I realized how lonely I was until it was too late. After my mom left, the house felt emptier. Even with my dad there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. And it wasn't just her. It was the way things used to feel, normal, whole. I didn't have that anymore. I tried to ignore it. Told myself it didn't matter. I mean, plenty of kids grow up with one parent. I wasn't special. But the truth is, I felt abandoned. Not just by my mom, but by everything I thought my life was supposed to look like. And that's when I started holding on to my dad harder than I should have. At first, it didn't feel like a big deal. We just talked more. About school, my friends, how I felt about the divorce. He listened in a way that no one else did. He actually cared. And when I cried, he didn't tell me to stop. He just held me and let me fall apart. I think I needed that. Someone who wouldn't leave. Someone who made me feel like I wasn't too much. Too emotional. Too needy. Too broken. But looking back, I can see how it started to cross lines, how I started to depend on him in ways that probably weren't fair to either of us. I didn't just want his attention. I needed it. And the more he gave, the more I craved. We'd have these late-night conversations, long after the movie ended, where I'd spill everything. My fears. My regrets. My insecurities. And he'd tell me it was okay. That I wasn't alone. That he'd always be there. And maybe that's why I stopped seeing him as just my dad. He felt like more than that. He felt safe. And safe was something I hadn't felt in a long time. I hate how desperate I must have seemed. How I let myself cling to him like that. But I didn't know how to stop. I'd wrap myself up in his attention and pretend it was enough to make me feel normal again. And the worst part? It worked. For a while, anyway. I felt wanted. Important. Like I mattered to someone. And when he'd tell me how proud he was or hug me a little tighter than usual, I soaked it up. I told myself it was just a dad loving his daughter. That's what I wanted to believe. That's what I needed to believe. But deep down, I think I knew I was walking a line I shouldn't have been walking. I wasn't blind. I saw the way his eyes lingered sometimes. Or the way he'd brush my hair out of my face and let his hand stay there a second too long. I told myself it was nothing. I made excuses for it. He was just being protective. Or affectionate. Or trying to make up for my mom leaving. And maybe all of that was true. Maybe it wasn't. I still don't know. But what I do know is that I didn't stop it. I didn't pull away or set boundaries. I leaned in because I wanted to feel loved, even if it wasn't in the way I was supposed to. And maybe that's why I blame myself as much as I blame him. I used to think I was strong. Independent. But sitting there with my dad, feeling his arm around me, hearing him tell me he'd always take care of me, I realized how fragile I really was. I wasn't as grown up as I wanted to be. I was still a kid trying to fill a hole that felt too big to handle. And I let myself believe that the closeness we had, the closeness I craved, was harmless. But it wasn't. And no matter how much I try to rewrite that part of the story, it doesn't change what happened next. By the way, if you've made it this far into the story, thank you for sticking with me. I know it's not an easy thing to hear, and I appreciate you listening. If you're finding this video interesting, or if you think there's someone who could relate to what I'm sharing, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps me keep sharing stories like this, and lets me know I'm not alone out here. Alright, let's get back to it. That night didn't feel different at first. It started like every other Friday, just me and my dad, sitting in his room, picking out a movie. It was our routine. Safe. Predictable. But looking back, I can see the cracks. The little moments that should have made me stop and question things. I didn't. I couldn't. Not then. I remember sitting close to him, like I always did. My head resting against his shoulder, my legs tucked under me. It wasn't unusual. It felt normal. Familiar. But at some point, somewhere between the opening credits and the halfway mark, I noticed the silence. Not the kind that comes when a movie gets serious, but the kind that feels heavy. Weighted. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was reading into things, because my mind wouldn't shut up. But the longer we sat there, the harder it got to ignore. The way he shifted slightly, but didn't move away. The way his breathing slowed, like he was suddenly aware of how close we were. I felt it, too. That tension. That quiet pull that made my stomach twist. And for the first time, I didn't feel safe. Not in the way I was used to. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something else, something I didn't want to name. I should have said something. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. I just sat there, pretending I couldn't feel the shift, pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't. My dad's hand brushed against my arm at one point. It wasn't intentional. At least, I don't think it was. But the second it happened, my whole body tensed. And instead of pulling away, I froze. I stayed there, trying to convince myself it didn't mean anything. But it did. It meant something. Even if I didn't want it to. I don't know how long I sat like that, stiff, uncomfortable, trapped inside my own head. I wanted to get up. I wanted to make an excuse and leave the room. But I didn't want him to notice. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting. So I stayed. I stayed because I didn't want to ruin the one thing that still felt normal in my life. I hated myself for it later. For letting it happen. For not doing something to stop it before it got worse. But in that moment, all I could do was sit there and pretend nothing had changed. Even though everything had. And maybe that's the part that still haunts me. The pretending. The way I let myself believe it was all in my head because it was easier than facing the truth. I've replayed that night in my mind more times than I can count. I've analyzed every glance, every touch, every word that wasn't said. And the more I think about it, the more I realize how much I missed. It wasn't just that night. It was the weeks leading up to it, the way we started sitting closer, talking longer, sharing things we probably shouldn't have. The lines had been blurring for a while. I just didn't want to see it. Or maybe I saw it and didn't care. Maybe I liked the attention too much to push it away. And that's what hurts the most, the not knowing if I let it happen on purpose. I've read about this kind of thing before. About how people in broken families sometimes form attachments that aren't healthy. About how loneliness can make you cling to people in ways you're not supposed to. But knowing that doesn't make it any easier to live with. It doesn't erase the guilt. Or the shame. Or the questions that still keep me up at night. Was it my fault? Did I misread the signs? Or did I ignore them because I didn't want to lose the one person who made me feel like I wasn't invisible? That's the part one keep coming back to, the way he made me feel seen. Like I mattered. And maybe that's why I didn't stop it. Maybe I was too scared of what would happen if I did. I wanted him to need me as much as I needed him. And once I realized that, everything else started to make sense. But making sense of something doesn't make it okay. And it doesn't make it hurt any less. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. After the movie ended, I went back to my room, shut the door, and sat there in the dark. My heart wouldn't stop racing, and my thoughts wouldn't stop spinning. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal, that I was overreacting, but no matter how many times I said it, it didn't feel true. I replayed everything in my head. The looks. The touches. The way the air felt heavy between us. I tried to pick it apart, to explain it away. But the more I thought about it, the worse it got. It was like my mind wouldn't let me forget. I felt disgusting. Not because of what happened, but because of what I let happen. Because I didn't stop it. Because some part of me didn't want to stop it. And that's the part one hated most. I didn't tell anyone. Not then. Not for a long time. I didn't even write it down because seeing the words would make it real. And I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to admit what I already knew. I thought about telling my mom, but what would she even say? She'd left. She'd moved on. I didn't think she'd believe me. And even if she did, what could she do about it? Nothing. And my friends? No chance. They didn't know this side of me. They only saw the version I wanted them to see, the one who laughed at their jokes and pretended everything was fine. I couldn't ruin that. I couldn't let them see how broken I really was. So I stayed quiet. I swallowed it down and buried it as deep as I could. But it didn't go away. It just sat there, under the surface, waiting to come out. I started second-guessing everything. Every word. Every glance. Every hug. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was I imagining things? Was I making it bigger than it was? Or was it exactly what it felt like, and I just didn't want to admit it? I didn't trust myself. And the more I questioned my own feelings, the harder it got to be around him. But at the same time, I couldn't stay away. I needed him too much. And that's what scared me the most. I told myself it wasn't his fault. That he didn't mean to make me feel this way. That I was the one who messed everything up by getting too attached. But the guilt didn't stop. Neither did the shame. I started pulling away. Little by little. I stopped sitting so close. Stopped talking as much. Stopped staying up late in his room. And I could tell he noticed. He didn't say anything, but I could feel it. The distance. The confusion. The way he looked at me like he didn't understand what had changed. I didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell someone you're scared of something you can't even name? How do you admit that the person who's supposed to protect you is also the person who makes you feel the most vulnerable? I couldn't. So I didn't. But secrets don't stay buried forever. They eat at you. Slowly. Quietly. Until there's nothing left. I started feeling anxious all the time. Like I was waiting for something bad to happen, even when nothing was wrong. I stopped sleeping through the night. Stopped eating as much. Stopped feeling like myself. And the worst part? No one noticed. Not my dad. Not my friends. Not my teachers. I was falling apart, and no one could see it. I don't know if it would have been different if I'd spoken up sooner. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. Or maybe it would have saved me from everything that came after. But I'll never know. And that's something I have to live with. What I do know is this: emotional lines are easy to cross, especially when you're lonely. And once they're crossed, you can't go back. You can't unfeel it. You can't unsee it. And you can't pretend it didn't happen. I've thought a lot about boundaries since then. About how fragile they are. How easy it is to let them slip when you're desperate for connection. And how hard it is to put them back once they're broken. I didn't want to lose my dad. And maybe that's why I let things go further than they should have. I wanted to hold on to what we had, even if it wasn't healthy. Even if it hurt me. But the truth is, love, real love, doesn't work like that. It doesn't blur lines or break boundaries. It doesn't leave you feeling small or scared or ashamed. Love is supposed to make you feel safe. And what I felt that night? That wasn't love. It took me a long time to say the words out loud. Longer than I'd like to admit. I'd rehearsed the conversation 100 times in my head, but every version felt wrong. Too angry. Too soft. Too broken. And maybe that's because I didn't know what I wanted from him. An apology? An explanation? Or just proof that I hadn't imagined it all? But I couldn't carry it anymore. The silence. The shame. The weight of it all. I needed to let it out, even if it shattered everything we had left. So one night, I sat him down. No movie. No distractions. Just us. And before I even opened my mouth, I saw it in his face. He knew. The words came out shaky at first. I told him how that night had made me feel, confused, scared, and ashamed. How I'd spent months questioning myself, wondering if I was the one who let it happen. I told him I didn't hate him, but I couldn't pretend it didn't happen either. And for the first time in my life, I saw him break. He didn't try to deny it. Didn't make excuses. He just sat there, eyes red, hands shaking, and said he was sorry. Over and over again. And as much as I wanted to hate him in that moment, I couldn't. Because I saw it, the regret. The guilt. The pain. And it hit me that he'd been carrying his own weight, too. I didn't forgive him that night. I couldn't. But it was the first time I let myself see him as more than just my dad. He was human. Flawed. Messed up. Just like me. And that's when I realized I couldn't fix him. I could only fix myself. I started therapy the week after our talk. I didn't think it would help at first. I figured I'd sit there, say the same things I'd been telling myself for months, and leave feeling just as lost. But it wasn't like that. The first thing my therapist told me was that what happened wasn't my fault. And hearing someone else say it, someone who didn't know me, didn't love me, made it feel real. I didn't cause it. I didn't deserve it. And I didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Therapy forced me to look at myself in ways I wasn't ready for. I had to face how much I'd relied on my dad for validation. How I'd let my loneliness cloud my judgment and blur boundaries I should have kept clear. And it hurt. But it also made me stronger. I learned how to set boundaries, not just with my dad, but with everyone in my life. I learned how to recognize red flags before they turned into scars. And most importantly, I learned how to trust myself again. My dad and I didn't talk for a while after that night. I needed space, and so did he. But slowly, we started to rebuild, not the way we were before, but something new. Something healthier. We went to therapy together a few times. It wasn't easy. There were a lot of tears, a lot of hard conversations. But it helped us understand what went wrong, how grief and loneliness had pushed us into a place we never should have been. It didn't erase what happened. It didn't make it okay. But it helped us move forward without pretending it didn't exist. Looking back, I see how easy it is to lose yourself when you're hurting. How quickly loneliness can make you hold on to the wrong things, just so you don't feel empty. And how dangerous it is to ignore the lines that are meant to keep us safe. I wish I'd seen it sooner. I wish I'd spoken up before it got to that point. But wishing doesn't change the past. All I can do now is learn from it, and hope my story helps someone else do the same. If I could go back, I'd tell that younger version of myself that love isn't supposed to feel confusing. It's not supposed to leave you questioning your worth or wondering if you did something wrong. Love is supposed to feel safe. And if it doesn't, it's okay to walk away, even if it's from someone you care about. I didn't know that then. But I know it now. Loneliness doesn't always look like sitting alone in an empty room. Sometimes, it's sitting right next to someone and still feeling invisible. Sometimes, it's reaching for comfort in places you shouldn't because it's easier than admitting how empty you feel. That's what happened to me. I let my loneliness make decisions for me. I let it blur lines and twist boundaries until I couldn't tell where they were anymore. And for a long time, I blamed myself for that. But what I've learned since then is that loneliness isn't just an emotion. It's a warning sign. It's your mind telling you that something's missing. That you need connection. Support. A reason to feel grounded. And when you ignore that need, or try to fill it with the wrong things, it only gets worse. For me, healing started with admitting the truth. Not just to my dad, but to myself. I had to stop pretending I was okay when I wasn't. I had to stop making excuses for the things that hurt me and start facing them instead. Therapy played a big role in that. It gave me space to talk without judgment, to process what happened without feeling ashamed. But it wasn't just about talking. It was about learning how to trust myself again. How to rebuild my confidence and let go of the guilt that had been holding me down for so long. And it's not just therapy. Healing also comes from having the right people around you, people who see you, hear you, and remind you that you're not alone. Whether that's friends, family, or support groups, it matters. Because no one gets through this kind of thing alone. One of the biggest lessons I've learned is how important boundaries are. Emotional closeness is a good thing, but only when it's balanced with respect. When you lose that balance, relationships start to feel heavy instead of safe. So I've learned how to set boundaries and stick to them. I've learned how to listen to that gut feeling that tells you something's off, instead of brushing it aside. And most importantly, I've learned that it's okay to walk away from people, even people you love, if being close to them is hurting you. If you're dealing with something like this, don't stay silent. Talk to someone you trust. A friend, a counselor, anyone who will listen without judgment. I know how scary it is to open up about things that feel shameful or complicated, but the truth is, you're not as alone as you think you are. There are people who will believe you. People who will help you find your way back to yourself. And letting them in doesn't make you weak, it makes you brave. Healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it. Growing from it. Taking what hurt you and turning it into something that makes you stronger. And that's what I'm still doing, learning, growing, and reminding myself every day that I'm worth more than the mistakes I've made. If you're struggling right now, just know this: you're not broken. You're not unlovable. And you're not alone. Whatever you've been through, it doesn't define you. You get to decide what comes next. And no matter how hard it feels, you can move forward. This isn't just a story about one mistake. It's about how fragile relationships can be, and how easily emotions can spiral out of control when boundaries aren't clear. We don't always recognize the warning signs. Sometimes, we're so caught up in trying to feel loved, understood, or seen that we ignore the things that don't feel right. We make excuses. We tell ourselves it's nothing. But those little moments add up, and before we know it, we're somewhere we never thought we'd be. That's why it's so important to step back and really look at the relationships in our lives. Are they built on respect? Trust? Do they make us feel safe, or do they leave us questioning ourselves? And if something feels off, it's okay to address it. It's okay to speak up. To set boundaries. To walk away if you have to. Because protecting your mental and emotional well-being isn't selfish, it's necessary. So ask yourself, when was the last time you really examined your relationships? Are they giving you what you need, or are you holding on to something that's hurting you more than it's helping? I didn't ask myself that question soon enough. But you still can. And if nothing else, let this be a lesson. Loneliness can lead you down paths you never expected to take. Don't let yourself drift so far that you can't find your way back. Pay attention before things unravel, because once you step over that line, there's no undoing it. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Your thoughts matter, so feel free to share them.